Welcome to episode 191 of the Hunting Party Podcast. I'm Arth from the Warcraft Hunters Union.
And I'm Darkbrew from thebrewhall.com and the Brew Hall on Twitter.
And I'm Alexander from the Hunting Party Podcast.
And today is Saturday, October the 19th, 2013. And if you want to participate in the chat room and have your name mangled on the air, just create a cool huntery name and join in on the fun.
Yep, and joining us today in the chat room, we have Alderanya, Aldaris, BM Jager, Cab, Druid Tamer, Elapide, Havtor, Juniez EU, or Juniez, Ligerwolf, Slugslinger, The Great Dane, Verg, and Warbinny. And our lovely moderator, as always, is Ali Sonder. You can send your questions into Ali in a private message by left-clicking her name, selecting PM, then typing in the new tab. Or you can send your question to huntingpartypodcast@gmail.com, and we'll try to get to it on a future show.
All right. So what do we have? A little bit of announcements. Well, yeah, first thing here is we were hoping to have Roger Brown on the show with us today, the hunter from Method, but unfortunately he's not a hunter in real life, and he's got a job, and real life things got in the way. So he wasn't able to join us today, and he was very saddened by that.
Yeah, and we just kind of found out about this. It was sort of a last-minute thing, and he did feel bad about it. We are going to still have him on. We're tentatively targeting November 9th for him to be on now. So we'll let you know about that, and he sends his apologies, and we'll still be able to talk to him, and that'll still be plenty of time. You know, the content in Siege of Orgrimmar will still be relevant at that point, so we'll be able to discuss a lot of raid elements.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, since this is the final raid of this expansion, it'll be relevant for a while. Although I tell you, it feels like, not to drift too far away from this, but it's only been out like a month. It's been like 5 weeks now since patch 5.4, and it feels like things are really winding down a little bit. And I think maybe Flex Raid has something to do with that. The fact that it's not too difficult. I tried Garrosh this week, didn't kill him. We'll definitely kill him, at least in that version, next week, and it just sort of feels like between that and then the island and seeing all the content that we're just burning through things very quickly here.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it keeps going for some hunters for a while, and there's still some relevant content.
I think it will, and the heroic stuff is what I think will keep people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Busy. Absolutely. But it should be noted that November the 9th, that's actually the Saturday of BlizzCon, and Roger's going to be there at BlizzCon. We won't. We'll be here. So if he is able to join us, it'd probably be, maybe not at the beginning of the show, but it would be, a live at BlizzCon report for him.
That'd be awesome.
Which I think would be great, because I think Method I would be shocked if they weren't participating in the live raid that they've got planned for Saturday morning. So this would be shortly after the live raid, so he'd be able to join us and talk about that and everything else that he's seen at BlizzCon. So yeah, if he is able to make it for that,
that may actually work out better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And we do still have BigRedKitty is still scheduled to be on next week.
Yep, 99.9% certain that is going to happen. But I don't want to jinx it too hard here. But that's looking good right now. So yes, and he's also looking forward to coming back on the show. I could tell you that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think BRK actually sought us out not too long ago.
He did.
We had been talking about having him on anyway, so it was good timing. Okay, so yeah, that's the upcoming schedule, and we do have some stuff to talk about this week. They released a schedule for BlizzCon. We have HCERP stuff to talk about a little bit. I also went through, and we're far enough into 5.4 that we can talk about things like class and spec distribution and PvE and PvP. So we have some mined data on that we can talk about as well, to kind of see how hunters are doing. So it was not the busiest of weeks, but not a completely dead week in news either. So let's jump in here. The first thing, so I actually wanted to release the final, like the master list of which I am going to rename before we go live with it. So the Hunter Community Expansion Revamp Project. It's going to get a sexier name here this week, but I actually wanted to release it last week. I've just been very, very busy at work, and I haven't had time to. I've been a lot of late nights and such, so I haven't really had time to go through and incorporate all the edits that I wanted to and really get it to a polished point. But time is of the essence at this point, so it's actually on my agenda for this weekend, and it should be the first thing you see on the WHU on Monday. So there's not a whole lot left to do with it. I think at this point it's just sort of how much play in the community, in the greater community, are we going to be able to get? How much are people going to be like, oh, that's stupid, forget about it, or will they be like, yeah, this is a great idea, let's get behind it. So I don't really know what kind of reception it's going to get, but I'm hoping for a big one, and I'm not afraid to make a fool of myself and or annoy a few people trying to make a big deal out of it.
Awesome. Yeah, so look forward to seeing that. I think that was it's been an interesting project and one, a really worthwhile project. I really like the fact that you did that.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that so people don't get to see like behind the scenes of this too much, but even some of the initial articles that I wrote, I'd say majority of it, with the exception of maybe the soloing and tanking one, where it was a lot of my personal input. But with that exception, most of the other ones, the vast majority of what was in there were ideas that had not come from me personally, that had come from people within the community that I had heard either on the WHU, in the general forums, on the podcast, and there are a fair number of ideas that I've been able to incorporate since posting them as well, and we'll be doing. There's a few I still have to get to before I make it final. So it's really been cool to see the feedback from everyone. And please note that if you suggested something and it went ignored, it was read and considered. There's only so much that I can fit into it, and you kind of have to take the ideas. I did have to sort of play arbitrator, in the sense that pick the ideas that I think are either most relevant or most likely, or the ones that have the most backing behind them. So there was some subjectivity in that sense with me kind of playing judge and jury on the ideas. However, I tried to incorporate anything that I saw as feasible and relevant and potentially good for the class.
Yes, I think that's like I said, it's a very cool project, and I think I would be, I wouldn't be surprised. I think it'll be well received, but maybe we may very well see one or two changes come out of that too. It wouldn't surprise me at all to see that some of that information taken to heart. I mean, the hunter community certainly has driven changes to the hunter class. Some of the big things are the obvious things, like needing to lose minimum range, but it's just something we harped on, and eventually came to fruition. And of course, Stampede, I think, is really the big one that the community in general pushed for.
And then as Blizzard went and made Stampede not as fun. But
no, they didn't. It's a little bit. It's better. It's much better now than it was.
True.
But still. Yeah.
So that'll be happening. I'm going to try to get the attention of some of the. Obviously, you can tweak Ghostcrawler, but I'm going to try to get the attention of some of the devs, even if they just say, quiet, we hear 800 things a day about people who think they know how to change the game. Like, that's what I'm expecting, but I'm still going to try. So,
as long as it's not just buff this, buff that, buff the other, then, if all it is us demanding buffs, then no, they're going to disregard that. They don't want to hear that.
Honestly, that's like the one thing that I didn't say at all, because that's just a balancing issue, and that's something you really have to leave to Blizzard, because saying buff us doesn't mean anything if they're buffing other classes more, or it's all in relation to one another, balancing with the content and between classes. So that I don't think I used the word buff the entire time. So maybe that'll help us.
Yeah, it can't hurt.
Right. So yeah, I expect that. It's a little behind schedule right now, but it's going to be coming out soon.
Cool.
All right, and we do have a schedule that was released, schedule and panels released for BlizzCon. So if you're going to BlizzCon or if you're following BlizzCon, these are some of the things that you can expect.
Yeah, and it's going to be, start Friday, November the 8th, continue on through Saturday, November the 9th, and I guess officially end on Sunday, although there's no events planned on Sunday. Sunday's just the day that everybody gets out of Dodge as quickly as they got there. And I didn't write down the full schedule here because, Blizzard is more than just, believe it or not, more than just World of Warcraft. They've got, Diablo and StarCraft and Hearthstone, but so there'll be panels and things related to those things, but we don't care so much about that. At least I don't. But there's plenty of stuff they've got planned for World of Warcraft, so I think it's going to be very cool.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, some of this, I don't want to say it's filler material, but you got to talk about some of the art of World of Warcraft. They might be releasing um, new shots from things or new concept art, things like that. Same with the evolving sound of World of Warcraft. So maybe they're releasing some new music. Maybe they're going to talk about. Maybe they're getting some orchestral versions of pieces. Who knows? There might be some interesting announcements there.
I mean, after the opening ceremony, the first World of Warcraft panel is World of Warcraft. What's next? I assume that would be talking about plans for the next expansion and whatever 10th anniversary stuff that they've got going on. I mean, 2014 is going to be a big year for them because the game does, hard to believe, turn 10 years old, and they're going to be planning some big events and big things, cool things for that. Try and
hopefully a really cool pet.
Yeah, a cool pet or something. Something better than the tabard that gives you, a bunch of experience. Not that that's bad, but for 10 years we need something a little bit more substantial. Maybe like a little Arthas pet. Little Lich King.
I think they should just send you a custom-made cloak if you've been playing since vanilla. But
make your subscription free for the year or something. That would be too bad.
Oh man, yeah. I doubt we'll see something like that. But.
Yeah, I doubt that either. But but it is a big deal. 10 years of World of Warcraft, not just Warcraft, but World of Warcraft is a huge milestone for them. So I would expect to hear about that. Another panel they had there was World of Warcraft: The Adventure Continues. I take that to be their lore panel. I imagine they're going to talk about what they've got going on there.
That was my assumption too, which some people will be very interested in. Ollie can fill us in on what happens, and we can blissfully ignore it. But the other panel that they have on Friday the 8th is the art of World of Warcraft, which I alluded to earlier, and we don't know exactly what this will be, but maybe it's just some new shots, maybe it's some new concept art, things like that. So might be interesting to see where they take that.
Yeah, and then starting on day 2, on Saturday morning, they're going to have the World of Warcraft live raid. I don't know who they bring in for that. I think Method for sure. They usually get a couple of the big guilds, and then they basically do some sort of competing raid, or sometimes I think they've done in the past something special specifically for BlizzCon. So it's not like we just watch them running through Siege of Orgrimmar, for example. They might have some specially crafted bosses, some things of tougher difficulty. So that's always fun.
Well, last time they did they stuck them out in front of Orgrimmar, and then they had various monsters from the expansion that was about to be launched, which is, of course, this one. And then, like, giant buffed up super versions of them. And they would bring them in, and then, like, give them no time to defeat them, like 60 seconds. And they got it. And then at the very end, Deathwing came over and did the fire thing, and so they were the very first ones to get the Killed by Deathwing achievement.
Yeah, that sounds cool. So whatever they come up with, it should be a lot of fun. And yeah, with any luck, we can talk to Roger Brown about that. That might be something.
Yeah, that's what I'm hoping that too. Like I said, I'm sure he'll be participating in that, and then after that, can tell us all about it.
Yep. So the panel after that is the evolving sound of World of Warcraft, which I also mentioned just a few minutes ago. And again, that should be nice. There's some people that really enjoy the music and the sounds and of the world, and they get into that aspect of it. So I'd be interested to hear what comes out of that. I have a lot of music from WoW and really enjoy it. So might be interested to hear if they have new music coming out or better versions of old stuff. So any of that I think would be really cool.
Yeah, like I said, the music has always been very enjoyable and very top notch for World of Warcraft, and they've been fortunate to have Russell Brower be there for the whole time. So they've had a lot of consistency over these years in terms of having the same person kind of compose it all and work on that, and I think that's helped a lot.
Yeah, there's something to be said for maintaining the same stylistic idiom within a game.
Yeah, stylistic, and makes it easier for him to sort of understands the music, understands what he's done previously, and kind of draw on some of that, and kind of have some sort of fluidity moving forward. So yeah, might be cool. The next panels, I think, one of the big ones, the World of Warcraft raids, gameplay, questing, and more. It sounds like, and normally I think they used to just have a separate kind of raid panel. Now it sounds like they're taking all that raids and everything else and kind of lumping it into one giant panel, and I imagine it's going to be.
I feel like that'll be the nuts and bolts. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one you pay attention to, because they'll talk about probably mostly new features they're planning in the next expansion, some of the things they're changing, things they like, things they don't like, and they'll talk probably a little bit about the new raids, and we'll find out that, when the expansion launches, if they follow suit, it'll be, maybe three smaller raids, and then, they'll go from there.
Yeah, so that'll be probably the one with the most news coming out of it for the bloggers and whatnot. And then they have a Warcraft movie presentation, which is towards the end of day 2. So that they're saving this for towards the end, but that'll be details on. I assume they'll have a trailer or some specifics about the Warcraft movie. I'm sure they're holding on to some details right now that they haven't released that they do already know. So that should
I'm
be
sure too.
Yeah, that should be exciting at least. We gotta wait for that though. I mean, that's not going to be until 2015. They're not starting filming until next year. So I mean, if we have a trailer, it might not even be. It's not even going to be like real time stuff. Just a teaser thing. So I don't know quite what they'll be presenting.
I don't know. Yeah, they'll be able to, and they probably obviously don't want to talk. Probably won't get into too many details about the plot. They might talk about things they're planning. I mean, there hasn't even really been any casting information. That'd be a great time to introduce, one or two cast people.
Yeah, I was thinking they could have like a panel of some cast members that they announce or something. Might be cool.
Bring in the director and a couple of people that they've got lined up to play, big roles. That I wouldn't be surprised at all if they did that. That would be a kind of a neat thing to do, and kind of keep that all on the down low, and would be a really neat surprise. So
yeah,
but it'll be good to get any kind of information about it. I mean, for so long we wondered if the movie was even ever going to happen. It'd been talked about since, I want to say, back when Wrath of the Lich King was going on. I mean, you're talking 4 or 5 years ago. They've been talking about doing this movie, and now it's really happening, and it sounds like it's got a chance to be pretty decent, right? I mean, this is not going to be some B-grade movie. They've got real studio and throwing real money into it, and this is going to attempt to be a legitimately blockbuster type movie. And who knows, it could and we could see another one, or they could do it in a way where if it works out, we might get 1 or 2 other films to follow on after this. So
yeah, everybody, all the marketing execs want trilogies these days. So if it does well, I wouldn't be surprised to see that. I mean, we're in a good age right now for movies like this, because even a decade ago there would have been a lot of skepticism surrounding a movie like a World of Warcraft, because it's the same way with, like, I'm a big comic book fan and all the movies that have come out recently, but there was a time when taking comic book movies seriously wasn't a thing. They were jokes for a long time. There was a few here and there that were still sort of campy, like the old Batman films, like the Tim Burton Batman films, that did fine, but they still weren't really considered serious cinema. And now you have these huge blockbusters and A-list directors and talent and all this money being thrown at it, and they're building entire worlds. Something like what happened with the Avengers that would have been inconceivable a decade ago, that they could actually build this whole world around a movie series into something like that. And it just shows the evolution of sort of these genres that used to be on the margins of society, sort of the geek culture style movies. And I think Warcraft falls into that. So I think people will be expecting a lot more out of it now, and this is a good time to be making it, as opposed to even 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. I mean, there were some good movies like this coming out even in the early 2000. Was it 2000 when Lord of the Rings series kicked off? So I mean, I think that sort of began the idea that you could have these CGI, sci-fi, fantasy movies and have them be good, like really good. And I think that.
Yeah, that certainly contributed to it as well. The Lord of the Rings ones. That's a good point.
Yeah, but I agree. I don't think the timing is bad for them to do the Warcraft movie right now. I think it's got a chance to be really good.
Yeah, and then the final panel on day 2 is just a Q&A. It says about almost everything. So basically just, hey, ask the devs and the execs whatever you want, whoever's on the panel. Just ask whatever.
Yep, that's where people get up there and they say things like, "Why do you hate my class?" or
Yep.
"Don't nerf me," and all that good stuff. It's but hey, you never know. People can be silly and stuff like that. But if you play your cards right, you could end up with a little character in game sitting there in Ironforge as the Wildheimer fact checker. I think that was a BlizzCon Q&A person. Someone called them out on a mistake they had made with their lore going on in I think the Cataclysm beta or something. And then sure enough, the guy turned out to be right, and they created a little character and stuck him in Ironforge.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the kind of in-game tribute that I would want to have. Having an item named after you seems cool to me. Having an NPC based on correcting an obscure bit of lore, that's a little different. I really shouldn't judge. This sounds like I'm judging. I'm not judging. I might be judging a little. So those are the panels. That's BlizzCon. We may have more, but we'll certainly have more when BlizzCon is happening, which is not too far off now. So it's
really not. It's just it's less than a month away. It's about 20 days or something like that.
Yeah, a few weeks, just a few weeks. So actually, 1, 2, yeah, exactly, 20 days. So that'll be cool, and we'll have more as it comes out about that. And of course, following BlizzCon, there'll be a lot of different announcements too. So. One of the transitioning now into something very not BlizzCon related, unless you have anything else to mention about that.
No, other than I'm looking forward to, even though won't be at BlizzCon, I am looking forward to hearing all the news and events that come out of it. But no, I'm ready to talk about Hunter stuff now.
Yeah, sure. So one of the things that I've done periodically, pretty much for the last 3, 4, maybe even 5 big patches, was go in and look at some of the numbers of class and spec distribution in PvE and PvP, and to determine what that can tell us about the state of the Hunter class. So we do have some returns. I feel like we've been in 5.4 long enough that we can start to get a sense of what's going on here. Now this isn't a perfect representation. Very few things are, but especially in PvP, I feel like it's a decent idea of who's doing well, because you can directly see like how many relative to other classes and specs hunters are at 1800 plus or 2200 plus in arenas, to see who's doing the best and what kind of representation we have. PvE, it's a little bit trickier because being brought in on raids doesn't necessarily mean we're doing the highest DPS, but there is a few things that we can still glean from it. And I tried to pair it a little bit with some data from World of Logs as well, so that we have a better idea of what hunters are doing right now.
So, although I don't PvP, what's happening with PvP? Let's get that out of the way.
Yeah, well, the first thing is that we're not hunter related, but the first and probably most horrible thing about PvP right now is arms warriors continue to just annihilate everybody. At 22.5% of all players at 2200 plus this is in threes. I should qualify some of this. I'm looking at the best players, so heroic kills in PvE and higher level arena in PvP. And in PvP, I looked at threes specifically because that, more than anything, is what Blizzard tries to balance. Is what they try to balance for, and also it's what most people do. There's way more people doing threes than 2s or 5s. So that's what we're looking at, because we have the best, the biggest numbers, the most representation overall. So 22.5 of all players at 2200 plus are arms warriors, which is absolutely ridiculous. No one else is even close. And this is in threes, of course, but there's way more people in threes, so that's giving us a good idea. Warriors and priests are the highest represented across all comps and all formats, 2s, 3s, 5s. So warriors are doing well in general, but specifically arms warriors just destroying. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some nerfs, because it's at the level that Beastmaster Hunters were at the beginning of this expansion, and probably even worse than Beastmaster Hunters were at the beginning of this expansion. One of the things that we can't look at anymore is top comps, and they explain it on World of War graphs in detail, but the way Blizzard changed arena teams is that you can just go in with anyone now. You don't need an arena team. And the way they set it up and the way it's coded now, you can't track comps like you used to be able to. So we actually can't look. Yeah, we actually can't look at the top comps anymore. And he apologized profusely for it, but he said it's just I can't do it anymore. So we have no data for the top comps. We do have representation data for individual classes and specs, but we can't look at comps to see what's doing well with what else, which is a little disappointing. And I hope they're able to correct that somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if that was something intentional on Blizzard's part, or if they, well, I mean, I know they don't tend to care about the third-party stuff out there so much. You know, they break your add-on or your website or whatever you're tracking. They don't. That's too bad for you, right? I mean, you know, so they don't care a whole lot about that. But I'm just curious. I mean, obviously, players who do these things have to have some idea of what works and what doesn't work, and what's the best and what's not. I don't know.
Yeah. So if someone's like heavily into it, they might have a sense of it, but we can't track it sort of empirically like we used to be able to. That being said, looking at hunters specifically, so now we're looking at threes, we're looking at 2200 or higher. So these are the best PvP hunters. A surprising and, in my mind, somewhat cool trend is that the best hunter spec right now in PvP by a fair margin is marksman, which I didn't expect to see.
Yeah, see, I thought that was a typo at first, and so maybe you had it reversed.
No, I didn't.
But no, you had marksman first. I saw that, so that is interesting. I mean, I guess some of that is the silencing shot effect. Certainly, that has to be part of it.
Silencing, and I suppose the heavy nerf to burst damage from BM. So there's more hunters playing. There's more hunters in arena teams doing arenas as Beastmaster overall. So it's not that they're not playing it. There's actually more Beastmaster hunters in arenas than there are marksman hunters. But there's almost no Beastmaster hunters over 2200, and if you go down to 2000, 1800, so a little less strict, it stays the same. It's marksman is showing up as better than survival, which is showing up as better than Beastmaster. So in that order, and the gaps are relatively noticeable. So I think it's a combination of the silencing shot and the nerfs to burst damage that hurt Beastmaster. Maybe over nerfed, looking at these new numbers, maybe over nerfed a little bit, which I think was somewhat the fear. But hunters in general are doing okay. They're pretty middle of the pack overall, and that's across 2s, 3s, 5s, whatever. But marksman is definitely coming out on top right now. So
yeah, Lakey in the chat room's pointing out too that yes, silencing shot and also Chimera shot too was buffed, and in addition to doing damage, Chimera shot also has that self-healing component to it, which I imagine is extremely useful in PvP.
Yeah. So I guess the takeaway here is that if you PvP, then chances are you were playing Beastmaster. Based on the overall numbers in arenas, you probably are still playing Beastmaster, but try marksman. See how you like it. See if you can do a little bit better with it, because right now, especially at the higher levels, it's showing up as quite a bit better than the other two. So not as much better at over survival, but certainly over Beastmaster.
See, I like that too. I think that's kind of a neat thing, and I'm certainly okay with one spec being maybe better than the others in, say, PvP. But when you read that now and you think about PvP and PvE, it seems like you could argue now that all three specs are in a reasonably good place, where you've got two really solid PvE specs. Although to say that marksman isn't useful in PvE or you can't raid as marksman is not fair to marksman, certainly, and I don't know that that's actually true.
Right.
But to see all three specs be viable across the entirety of the game is a good thing. That means we continue to be in a pretty decent place right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So Arms Warriors probably need a nerf. The other surprisingly high spec was Holy Priests, and this was in threes. I was surprised to see them, because normally you don't see them at all in Traditionally, it's been either disc or shadow. So priests in general are doing well. They seem to always be doing pretty well across the board. PvE, PvP. If I didn't like hunters so much, I would just tell everyone to go play a priest, because they're never too far from the top in most things. It seems like. And I've been tracking this stuff since, or following those who did track it since, like, Wrath. So Holy Priests were actually the second most numinous spec outside of Arms Warriors right now across everything. So those two sort of separated themselves from the field, Warriors and Priests, and then everyone else is sort of in like a middle ground. I forget who's at the bottom, but Hunters are pretty middle of the pack at the moment. So that's PvP. And I think that those kind of representation numbers can tell us a little bit more about PvP. Their explanatory power in PvE is not quite as strong, I feel like. So it's always been interesting to see that, though. But in PvE, so now we're looking at raid groups that have killed 6 or more heroic bosses. So again, we're looking at the upper echelon of raiding guilds, because when we're talking about spec balance and class balance in Raid Finder, in Flex rating, even in a lot of regular raids, your skill, your gear, your raid composition and buffs and stuff, that's going to make a much bigger difference, and it's much less likely that you're going to be sat to kill a boss because you play a particular class. But when we start to look at the higher levels, we might see that a little bit, where you bring this class instead of this, or this spec instead of this, because at that point you're talking a little bit more about people who have the gear, who have the skill, but might not, so you might start juggling classes around a little bit.
Yeah, and you got to keep in mind too, especially in the early stages of these heroic raids, most of the guilds here, you're not fully geared up to do the heroic gear. It's not that you can't handle it, but you're probably not loaded down with a full set of, say, normal mode gear.
Yeah.
As soon as those guys clear normal once, which is usually pretty quick, they dive right into heroic. So they're really doing it mainly in whatever heroic gear, which is usually a full set of heroic gear from the previous tier. So it's not their gear is bad, but they're a little under geared than what other raid groups that will eventually get to heroics and maybe are just starting are, you know what I mean, where they've gone through a regular progression of normal and geared everybody up, and maybe even done flex and geared everybody up, and then they're attacking heroic that way.
Right, exactly. So more hunters have killed a raid boss than any other class, which makes some sense. So that's outside of heroic kills, because hunters are a popular class. I think we recently overtook, in 5.3, we overtook paladins as the most popular endgame class in the game. So hunters are wildly popular. You're going to see more of them in raids on average than you will any other class. Just running, if you're running LFR in guilds, things like that.
Yeah, I did an LFR and there were 10 hunters. I'm not joking. There was 10 of us.
Oh my god. So there's a lot of hunters overall. In heroic kills, so 6+ heroic kills, we're middle of the pack. We're the 7th most represented class of, 10, I believe? So, I mean, a little bit below the middle, but basically middle of the pack. The lowest are warriors, monks, rogues. It's been a bad expansion for rogues. They were actually much lower. They've come up a little bit. But monks, just because you don't get it took some time for them to gain some momentum, because not as many people were playing them early on as the other classes, because by this point a lot of people have their main character established. And warriors, I think, were the lowest overall. So I guess some retribution karma from their PvP dominance. Within the hunter class, let's see. So Beastmaster has the most representation. We're going to talk about DPS numbers here in a second too. As you might expect, Beastmaster has the most representation, then Survival, then Marksman. Marksman is actually the least represented overall spec of any class in Heroics, which I feel like hunters, more than any class, especially the pure classes, have a tendency just to race to whatever spec is supposedly the highest.
Sure.
I feel like as a community, that's what we tend to do. We're very polarized like that, and I don't see that a lot from other classes quite as much. So I don't think marksman's necessarily that bad, but it is the least represented overall. So we're pretty middle of the pack there. The two most represented specs in heroic, so 6+ heroic kills are Disc Priests and Shadow Priests, reinforcing my statement that Blizzard loves priests. I feel like they love priests, and in particular Shadow, which literally hasn't had a bad expansion or patch since I can remember. So
yeah, I was going to say, I mean, Shadow Priests seem to be very popular. You know, I don't necessarily see that many of them, at least with the.
But that's the thing. It's not that people are playing them. It's that they're in the highest levels. So they're not the best represented overall. Like hunters destroy them in overall representation. But then any spec of hunters outside of probably marksman is going to destroy them in overall representation. It's just at the highest levels you see them all the time. So I mean, unless they were doing, and it's not always that way, especially with like disc. Unless they were doing very well right now, I don't think we'd see such a, they're pretty far above the 3rd, 4th, 5th once you start going down. So both priest specs are the top 2 most represented right now in heroic kills, which is surprising to me, but good for priests. I don't mind priests. My alt, who is also at endgame, but I don't really do much with, is a priest. So he's maybe I should dust him off. He's a disc priest.
I think partly what it is that people don't like playing priest or healer classes. So maybe Blizzard tries to buff them up a little bit more so that people have an incentive to want to play, a slightly better damaging or whatever class. I don't know.
Yeah, that could be. I don't know that it's that. I mean, it probably isn't some conspiracy where Blizzard's thinking about this. It might just be random luck, over the course of an expansion or even expansions, plural. Statistically, someone's going to get the shorter end of the stick, and someone's going to get the better end of the draw as well. And so I feel like that might just be what we're seeing. The random statistical variance of classes in between each patch, and they've just come out near the top more often than not. But pairing this now with raid DPS numbers. So I went in, and there's a lot more analysis we can do within World of Logs, but I went in and I looked at 10, 25, and then 10 heroic and 25 heroic. The last few bosses, there isn't really enough data to be representative. But from what we had, pretty much across the board for hunters, there's no fight where survival is definitively above Beastmaster. There's enough people playing both of those that we can compare them at this point. Marksman isn't represented enough. There's too few people playing marksman to accurately say much about it. So it's much lower than the other two, but I don't necessarily know that that's indicative of just how much lower than Beastmaster in survival it is.
And I think a big part of that too, though, is, I mean, there's a lot of multiple ad fights, a lot of fights where the ads are even close to the boss, which is usually the main target. And the buff that they did to Beast Mastery AoE, I think made a big difference, especially with Beast Cleave as a nice ability now. So I think if the Beast Mastery AoE weren't quite where it is today, you might see some fights skew a little bit more towards survival just because of the number of ads that you're dealing with. But that's not really necessary now. BM can really hold its own in those situations.
Yeah, I think that AoE buff to BM helped more than people thought it would at first. They didn't realize how much it was going to close that gap. And there are some fights, with pet management, and Beast Cleave has like a radius around it that's sometimes hard to manage. So there are some considerations that might make survival easier to deal with on AoE fights, but I think the potential for Beastmaster is pretty equivalent. So, and I'm not just talking about like the top 1 or 2 parses in World of Logs, but across the board. Like I was looking at the top 200 essentially for most fights that we've seen. So there was no fight where survival was definitively better than Beastmaster. There were several fights where they seemed roughly equal, where if we were to derive the average or the median, it was going to be roughly equivalent. There wasn't a whole lot to say one way or the other. There are fights where Beastmaster is definitively better than survival. So I think that kind of reinforces what we knew and what we've seen and what we've heard from people who are doing these raids, is that if you're taking one spec, make it Beastmaster, but depending on your play style in the fight, you might have more success on certain fights with survival. And again, I don't think Marksman's that far off, and some of the numbers in the theory crafting that Bendak on Scattered Shots got a week or two ago say that Marksman might actually be just as good, not even just close, but just as good or slightly better than the other two occasionally. But we're not seeing that in the raids just because so many people are playing the other two.
Yeah, and I think, again, I mean, we tend to look at these specs in terms of, like I said, single target DPS, and there's so few single target fights nowadays. I mean, there's like maybe one or two that's purely a single target, but a lot of them are, and they're not just AoE fests either, but there's usually an ad. I mean, the ones where there's only like one or two ads you're DPSing, then obviously, you're more or less doing single target in those situations.
Yeah, somebody just said, I think he's probably catching up to us in the recording there, but Lakey in the chat room just said that he just referenced Bendak's Scattered Shots column as well, saying that they're all theoretically within RNG of one another. And of course, that's not in a raid environment. That's that's in testing, so it's not going to be a one-to-one comparison. But I think that's very true, that they're probably a lot closer than we realize, and that the vast difference we're seeing is probably more due to the people with the gear and the skill,
Yep.
and just more people are playing the other specs. So like I said, we don't have enough representation from MM at all to be able to say where it is or what it's actually capable of. So I don't want to go so far as to say that based on some tests that it is better. We can't go that far because, again, we haven't seen it in raids. But it might be worth a try if if you're interested in playing around and you want to try out a Marksman spec.
I would say if it's your favorite spec, you might want to give it a try, and it depends on the level of content you're doing. I mean,
Yeah.
if all you do is pop into LFR, it doesn't really matter what you are. I mean, it really doesn't matter, and even to some degree, flex raid probably doesn't matter a whole lot what spec you choose out of the three from that perspective. But and maybe even to some degree normal. It's really, I think, when you get to the highest level, when you start doing heroics, and is when you really start to really want to think about those little nuances, and that little bit of loss here or there, DPS, is where I think things can make a difference.
Yeah.
And again, that's until you get all the gear and you know the fights, and once you get things on farm, again, it probably doesn't matter a whole lot what you run as, I guess I think sometimes we make too big a deal about these little differences between the various specs, and I think we look at it saying, well, that it matters all the time and in every situation, and it really doesn't. I mean, it's very there are perhaps some situations where it does matter, but not everybody's going to encounter those situations, and the specs are probably close enough that you may very well want to play whatever one you enjoy the most.
Yeah. And if you're a good hunter, you're going to see yourself competing, and doing well with any spec. So I think that's true across the board, because the skill you put into it and being able to do things really well is going to make is going to reduce that to the point where you're largely talking about things like RNG,
right,
within fights. So I think if you're playing one and doing well, you might still want to try another, because really, with the spec comparisons, you might be doing good enough for your particular raid, but you're really competing against yourself to try to min-max your output there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a very good raid. I've enjoyed what I've seen of Siege of Orgrimmar. Like I said, I've mostly done just the flex stuff right now, and so I've seen everything. I've seen all the fights in one way or another, and it's well laid out, and it's I like the sort of the curve of progression, where it's like Throne of Thunder. At least with 10-man normal, you did the first boss, it was pretty easy, not hard to learn, and then you got to Horadon. And not to mention that the trash leading up to him was just awful, some of the worst ever. And then you got to that boss, and if you didn't have a good composition, you were hitting a wall, potentially hitting a wall immediately, and which wasn't a lot of fun. Whereas there's a slightly more difficulty progression I find with Siege of Orgrimmar, and you get through a few bosses, and then they toss an easy fight in there midway through to kind of give you a break, and then it goes on again.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Another thing, and this is something we've talked about before, and I was reminded of by a comment in the chat room, is that so we talk about raid DPS not necessarily being target dummy DPS, which is not necessarily testing and theory crafting DPS, but one of the things that's always played into it is some specs are just easier to maintain an optimal rotation. And I think at least in this expansion, survival has kind of been the easiest to do that. At least some of the mechanics have changed this time, and it might get a little spammy if you have Thrill the Hunt, but it was hard to. It's sometimes hard to be hitting all the cooldowns when you need to be in Beastmaster, and there's things that can get disrupted in Marksman. So if the fight mechanics are something that you're having to focus on and you're kind of losing track of your rotation or your priorities and maybe not hitting some shots at the point that you should, that might be something that plays into it as well. So it's all contextual. It's there's no definitive answer with some of this, especially when they're close.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things now that they've given us, even with this patch, that will impact rotations and impact DPS. I mean, whether or not you have the legendary stuff. The legendary cloak obviously is going to boost your DPS. That legendary metagem is going to really boost your DPS. But trinkets like Assurance of Consequence combined with your two-piece tier bonus, all of that's going to impact your rotation and what you play and which talent you choose and everything else. And so people are looking at a trinket like Assurance of Consequence with the two-piece tier bonus and combining that with Thrill of the Hunt, and it's cool. It's actually very cool. But I mean, now you're talking about shortening the cooldowns on specific abilities. Having rapid fire be available a lot more often than it used to, and using that now. So there are a lot of things they've done mechanically that impact our rotation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And those are fun. I don't mind those. It gives us something different to do,
It's funny when I think about those, like where we're reducing the cooldowns now on some of these abilities through that trinket, and even with rapid fire through the two-piece cheer bonus as well. We made a big deal about readiness and the loss of readiness, and how would we kind of make up for that? And I think that's certainly one way. It doesn't make up. I don't know if it makes up for it 100%, but it helps a little bit there by having rapid fire available almost every minute kind of thing, and Bestial Wrath on a very short cooldown now, and Stampede available every 3 minutes instead of every 5 minutes. I mean, that's a lot of DPS we're getting.
Yeah, no kidding. So it definitely does help, and maybe the loss of readiness was slightly overstated. I still miss it a little bit, but they've certainly made up for it in other ways. So the very last thing that I noticed that I did want to point out from the World of Logs data. So some fights lend themselves to certain specs better than others. So you see like weird things where 8 of the top 10 and 32 of the top 40 parses that we have are from a particular spec on fights, and that's not necessarily true across the board. It doesn't always mean that they're doing incredibly well overall. Maybe just that a particular fight's mechanics and setup lends itself to that class or spec. So we've seen that throughout pretty much every tier of content. It's not necessarily cause for alarm, but the one thing that I did notice in going through, and again, this was 10, 25, 10-man heroic, 25 heroic, and looking at the top 200 for each boss, for each one of those outside of the last few for the heroics, because we don't really have that much data on it just yet, because there hasn't been that many guilds to kill them. So the one thing I noticed is that warlocks seem to be at the top way more than they should. So a fight like the Fallen Protectors, it's like I'm not joking when I say that maybe in some of these, like I'm looking at 25-man normal right now, probably 80% of the top 200 parses are from what's the spec here? Is it Affliction or
I'm
trying
gonna
to-
guess affliction. Is that the?
Yeah, it's affliction. It's affliction. Yeah, I
Is that
don't know
the dot spec, I guess, or
Yeah, that's affliction. So there's so that is just like destroying across the board on the fallen protectors and some of these others. The destruction warlocks on Immersius I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but on Immersius are the same way. Not quite to the extent on the fallen protectors. And there's like 4 or 5 fights where you just see one of those two, destruction or affliction, is just showing up way too much. So, I didn't run all the numbers to see like averages and medians and stuff like that, but man, are they doing good on a few fights. And, not just the top few, not just like some rogue person who figured out a way to get way more than everyone else, but just all over the place, Asian servers, EU servers, American servers, it doesn't matter. There's just warlocks everywhere on a bunch of different fights. So that seemed to be the one where I'm looking at it going, this looks broken. So my sense is that warlocks need some sort of PvE nerf in a few particular ways to sort of bump them down and give the rest of us a chance on these fights. Hunters seem to be pockmarked around as much as any class, so I don't know that. So I looked at Beastmaster, Survival, Marksman to compare them on a bunch of different fights, but didn't really look at us compared to other classes for the most part. So they seem to be represented about as well as most classes, but I don't really have hard data on that.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's any fight that's particularly, I'm just trying to think, that's unfriendly to hunters necessarily. I mean, they're all pretty decent. I understand, I've heard of some of these fights have gotten to be a little bit more melee friendly than what they have been.
Which is fine.
Before,
Melee
which is
had
fine.
a hard time of it in some tiers of content. Melee had a real hard time of it in a couple tiers of content, so I don't mind that.
I mean, they're just even fights. I mean, our DPS when we're moving is still very good. I mean, we could still maintain the full rotation, even having to run around, which is just a wonderful thing, really. So I think, so a fight like, Nourishin, where he casts out this beam and you gotta run away from run around in a circle as this beam tracks around. I mean, that's one where we just don't lose a lot of DPS while moving, and it's compared to say some other classes perhaps, but
Sure.
I don't know that this has been a hunter unfriendly raid instance at all.
Yeah, it'd be pretty hard for something to be hunter unfriendly. We just have, like you say, we can do the mobile DPS. We have a lot of tools. We're pretty rounded as far as our utility and ability to bring DPS. So I think the only times we've really been nerfed are when there's a weird boss mechanic that affects our pet.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really been the only time in any tier of content that I've seen where saying, well, we can't do this, or the pet glitches, or weird things like that. So there have been a few like that in maybe not recent memory, but within memory, where it's hurt us a little bit. But otherwise we're pretty versatile. I don't think there's a raid encounter that's necessarily going to be anti-hunter.
No, although it is worth noting and it's worth continuing to spread the word to your raid leaders and everybody else who's not a hunter, that on the general Nazgrim fight, when he goes into defensive stance, it is okay to keep your pet on the boss. He will not cause General Nazgrim to stack rage, which is a bad thing. I mean, he goes into this defensive stance, and you want everybody to stop doing their DPS on the boss, but the hunter pets and warlock pets for that matter won't cause him to gain rage. So it's okay to leave your pet on the boss during that stance. You can't DPS him, but your pet can go crazy if you want. And that also means, I think, kill command. You can also even cast kill command because it's a pet ability. But I've just heard from some other people where they get yelled at for keeping their pets on the boss during that phase, and it's just not a problem. It's fine to do that.
Yeah, so someone said Majera screwed my pet last tier. So yeah, that was a bad example.
That was a bad pet fight. I don't know. I mean, sometimes you get out of range of the pet. That was just weird. When you talk about pet pathing issues, that was a fight that had that. I mean, there were times you'd be on the head DPSing, and you'd be hit and kill command and like nothing's happening, and
Yeah.
who knows where the pet was at that point. But yeah, that pet was a bad one for that fight was a bad one for us and our pets.
Yeah. There's actually been a few where the battle area is large enough that depending on what's going on and what we're doing with our pets and ourselves, that our pets could despawn.
Yes,
which hurt too. Yeah, especially if you didn't notice it right away, that could really hurt. So obviously, if you're casting something like Kill Command, it's not going to be too long before you realize why is it not letting me do this? But in the past, it hasn't always been quite so clear, and Beastmaster hasn't always been our top PvE spec. In fact, it hasn't been for a while until Mists of Pandaria.
Okay.
So.
And Lakey in the chat room saying Kill Command does give Nazgul Rage. I haven't really tried that. I guess maybe I haven't, but who knows? But I'll take his word for it. He said he's tested it many times to the chagrin of his raid. So, but I know the pets itself don't do it with their attacks.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think that was among the few tips and tricks that I had for 5.4 rating. About a week after it came out up on the WHU. So if you scroll back past the HCERP stuff, you might find that along with some other little hints here and there. So that's really all I was able to pull up. So it's not. I mean, that doesn't necessarily paint us a definitive picture of hunters in this, but I think paired with everything else we've heard, we're doing fine in PvE. There's maybe a few classes that need pulled one direction or another. Same with PvP. I wouldn't mind seeing a slight unnerf to the Beastmaster burst that we loved so much, but I don't know that that's necessarily going to happen following the nerfs that we've gotten. So, but we seem to be doing all right in both, pretty middle of the pack. And of course, we're a very popular class, and I still feel like we bring. There's been some discussion of like, what do we bring to a 25-man raid, and that to an extent can be true of a lot of that question is valid for a lot of different classes where they're not necessarily bringing something that no one else can bring. But we still have a lot of use in 10-mans, of course, and we bring a fair amount of utility in general to any situation. So. I think we're doing all right in 5.4. So I'll be interested to see what Blizzard has planned for us into the next expansion. But I think they didn't. I think there was a lot of the sky is falling mentality prior to 5.4, and I think we're really doing okay.
Yeah, I agree too. I think this has worked out pretty well. It's been a pretty decent expansion overall for the hunter class. So hopefully they just improve upon it with whatever is next, and they don't make things worse.
If nothing else, Mists of Pandaria was easily the best expansion ever for Hunter PvP.
Yes.
No, no other expansion even came close. And early on, we were just stupid dominant. So, I mean, as recent as 5.3, although not as much as in like 5.1 and 2, but as recent as 6 weeks ago, we were maybe the most dominant spec in PvP arenas. So I think Arms Warriors were competing with us, one or two others, but we were as good as any. So it's been the best expansion ever for Hunter PvP. PvE's been much more spotty. I think there's been a lot more criticism in Mists of Pandaria than there has been in the past about some of the things that they've done and some of the things that have and haven't worked. But I think they've gotten to a pretty decent place in 5.4 with everything.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure.
Okay, well it's I guess 3 o'clock, but it's 2 o'clock here. We had some tweets, but I don't know that they're necessarily necessary. Might be something we can touch on next week.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's just some real minor stuff. Nothing earth-shattering about the class. Nothing even all that intriguing. It was, a few people complaining about stuff more than anything else.
Right, and Ghostcrawler either telling them to be quiet as nicely as possible, or explaining why something is a certain way. We can probably talk about those next week or a different time, or if bigger and better news comes along. Like you said, nothing major, pretty minor stuff. So, feels like that hour went pretty quickly.
It did. It did.
It
Sometimes,
did.
we don't have a lot of hunter news. We find plenty of things to talk about for sure.
Yeah. I think we probably spent that last half hour talking about the spec distribution. So that's always an interesting topic to me, at least. So the Who articles that I've written on it have gotten a lot of feedback. So I feel like that's something that people like to see too.
I think people are used to us being very numbers oriented on this podcast, as opposed to other ones.
Yeah.
Well, we've always tried that. I mean, Frost was always very, very numbers oriented, so it's a little bit harder without him.
Yeah, filling those shoes is kind of tough. So, like, one of the things he used to do that I was talking to you two about, I think before we went live, was he would go into World of Logs, and I don't think there was any quick way to do this, but he would pull, like, hundreds of things for each class and each spec for each boss, and then he would find, I think it was the median that he would look for in all of them, and he would track them through 10, 25, 10 heroic, 25-man heroic, and he would have these wonderful graphs, and it was awesome because it really gave us probably the most comprehensive look at where we stood compared to other classes and who was doing really well and who wasn't. And something like what I was able to pull together today is, it gives us a good idea of where certain classes are at and how hunters are doing, but it's not as comprehensive. So I've tried to do as much as I can with the limited time that I have to paint a clear picture without maybe going into quite as much detail as he used to.
But yeah, I mean, that was his. He would do that every patch, and it was certainly an interesting read.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe maybe Bandek will figure out how to replicate that or do something similar. He had a nice article this week just on theory crafting in general, and it is nice to see that there are a number of tools now that we can use to kind of look at this data. We don't have to sit there and math it all out on our own.
Yeah, a lot of that was in the days before there was before female dwarf was so ubiquitous in the hunter community, and before we had things like Ask Mr. Robot, and so there was much more of a need for it. Whereas now that you do have those kinds of tools, so paired with some of the data that we're able to bring up like this, I think that very few hunters need to be in the dark if they're willing to put in a little bit of work and go to the sites that have this information.
Exactly.
So, all right, I think we're good. You guys ready to mess up the outro?
I was always ready to do that.
Okay. So, with that, you have been listening to episode 191 of the Hunting Party Podcast. I'm Arth from the Warcraft Hunters Union.
And I'm Dark Brew from thebrewhall.com and the Brewhall on Twitter.
And I'm Alexander from the Hunting Party Podcast.
All right, check us out on iTunes, YouTube, Stitcher, add our RSS feed to your reader. Links will be available in our show notes.
And if you like us, please don't be shy about leaving us a review on iTunes or YouTube, especially one where you mention how stupid warlocks are.
But not to their face. You can submit a title for this week's show by emailing us at huntingpartypodcast@gmail.com and have your name mangled on air by professional hunters.
All right, stay thirsty, my friends, and remember to drink your Dark Brew Lager.
For the Horde!
And nerf Shadow Priests, Arms Warriors, Warlocks in general, and Canada.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, I've had a couple. One of my friends in the game plays a Warlock, and yeah, he's always just topping meters left and right whenever we go in there. It's hard to keep up with him.
My first 5 characters were all Forsaken Warlocks. I was just really, really liking the class up till I got the blue thing. Because at the time it was in beta, so it was always like huge and in the way. So you couldn't target anything around it. So I'd get up to that and then go, this is horrible, and start all over again. So.
Yeah, I probably
I haven't actually played one since then,
Huh.
come to think of it.
Yeah, I probably angered some warlocks. I don't know how many listen to the show, but I can't imagine it's too many. There's so many general WoW podcasts, and I'm sure they attract more overall viewers because they're appealing to a wide variety. But ours is just so specific that I always just assume that there's nobody outside of hunters that are listening to this. But I suppose people have like alts and stuff.
Yeah,
So,
but the
Yeah,
hunter's
most
the
people have
main.
alts, but if the hunter's the main, then they don't really care about you.
yeah,
You know,
if they're listening to this podcast
Making
and,
fun of
and
the
a hunter
warlock.
isn't there, yeah, if the hunter isn't your main and you're listening to this podcast, what are you doing? So,
But
I suppose
definitely write it and let us know if your
Yeah.
hunter is not your main, but you're still listening to the podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, well, I shouldn't be scaring away.
I'm not sure why they would,
listeners
unless they,
either.
they have this deep desire to be a hunter, but they've just been,
Right.
need that little bit of extra encouragement to pull the plug. They're certainly not doing it to find out, how to defeat hunters in PvP. I mean, if you're a mage or a warlock or someone coming here for that information, you're gonna have to wait a long time before you hear us talking about
Yeah.
PvP to that degree.
Right. Yuri is no longer on the podcast. I don't
Yeah.
think we can talk about that anymore. So I had a twos comp in Wrath, which was a horrible time to have a twos comp as a hunter. But it was actually a lot of fun. But I was always raiding too much, and so when I spent time in game, it was just picking and choosing what I wanted to take seriously because I would have wanted to be all in on it, really take it seriously, do as much as I could with it, and that just wasn't possible. It was more just me and a friend having a good time. So there was very little burst at the time. He was a disc priest with great mana regen, and our whole strategy revolved around just trying to get the other healer to go out of mana first. Because we couldn't get them down otherwise. So we had these impossibly long PvP arena battles. But it was a good time. But yeah, I don't know much about MOP arenas outside of what we talked about today.
No, me neither. I've done a couple battlegrounds. I had to do a couple battlegrounds just for the legendary cloak quest line. They made you go do a little PvP.
Yep.
But and I went in there with about 3 or 4 people. It wasn't a fully made group, but I had enough people there that knew what they were doing. That it made it much easier to get through. And,
Yeah.
Battlegrounds are fun actually. I know I always joke about hating PvP, but they actually can be a lot of fun.
Yeah, battlegrounds are awesome. Just go in your PvE gear and wreck stuff, and you'll die instantly when people attack you. But but it's still a lot of fun, especially when you get
a
some
few
of the
kills
larger
in
ones.
there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, once you get used to the idea that death is actually not, like, meaningful.
Yeah.
You heard it here first, folks. Death is not meaningful.
I just need to know a little bit about what I should be doing, just so I don't really screw up any kind of strategy that may or may not be going on. You know what I mean? I'm not. I guess I know enough to do what I'm supposed to do, or not screw things up for the team. I'm not at the level between say like a 1 and a 10, where 1 being the people trying to do their holiday events, and 10 being rated PvPers. I'm probably somewhere in the middle, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's still the last thing I need to do for that achievement. Is the holiday orphan PvP.
Oh God, that was miserable. I remember doing that.
I haven't wanted it bad enough to guilt trip my guilds into taking me along, because oh man, I don't think you can do it solo unless you really are a PvPer.
Yeah.
Some of them, I don't know, you can. I mean, I remember that the big one for me was Eye of the Storm, and getting the flag and carrying it back to it. But that was the one that took me the longest.
I don't know how to run the flag. I mean, I know running, but how do you grab it and then pass it
You
around
just
and
run
all
up
that
to
business?
it, and I think you just click on it like any other object in the game.
People don't ever let me touch the flag, so
Yeah,
I didn't
mean,
know.
during the holiday period, some of the battlegrounds, it's not as hard as you think, because people get that you're there to get your achievement, and they'll actually help you out. They'll make it easy for you. a couple of those capture the flag ones are like that. Eye of the Storm was not like that. I don't, it was just a bunch of people getting pissed off that everyone was there to get their achievements, and they weren't actually trying to win the battleground or doing what you were supposed to do to win the battleground. They were just there to grab that flag and run, and then leave.
Yeah, but I mean, some of the most fun I've had, just because it's fun but pretty low stress, is when I'll just come on and I'll have some guild mates. There'll be like 5 or 6 of them. Be like, hey, we're running battlegrounds. Why? We're running battlegrounds, like no particular reason, and so there's no
because the queue is short.
Yeah, there's no expectation. It's what's it called where you get more rep, like the weekly or whatever it is, or the daily, or but anyway, like, hey, we're doing this, and you just for like 2 or 3 hours run battlegrounds with a bunch of PvE geared people as you dick around and vent. It's relaxing and fun, and you're still doing something. You can work together. You can talk strategy and stuff without having it's not life or death like progression rating. So that's actually some of the most fun I've had playing, is just random ass battlegrounds like that.
Yeah, I mean the old fun. I mean, you want to go talk about a 10-year-old game going back 10 years. I mean, the most fun PvP used to be those skirmishes, those South Shore and Hillsbrad.
Yeah.
Oh, those were legendary.
Or South Shore and Terran Mill, I should say. Those battles that just kind of spontaneously would erupt from time to time.
Those were all-day things. I mean, you would log in. I'd come home from work or school, and just they were always going on. It was the worst place ever to level through, but it was so much fun.
The first thing I did when I hit endgame in Wrath was I went to Terran Mill and I just slaughtered everybody. It was my gift to myself, because that whole area, because I was on a PvP server at the time, and like now that wouldn't be doable. But yeah, that was great. I went with a buddy, and we just like killed low level people for about an hour. So,
what was the one that the original ones, Alterac Valley and I can't even remember now. It's been so long. But there used to be like a faction thing that was an achievement to get the 3 factions for
the basin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always wanted to get that, so I tried to do it for a while and just kept plugging away. And then I realized just how many times I was going to have to run these, and I kind of lost heart. But I do like getting reps, but that's a little much. But that was always a fun one too, running down the hill and all that. I never saw. I've heard about the times when they used to have like week-long battles doing that, as opposed to just like an hour or half an hour. Because by the time I started playing the PvP, it was just charge your enemy's general and defend the bridge, and that was it. But I understand in the old days it was gathering the resources and doing all that stuff that you used to have to do, and the people would log out for the night and come back and it'd still be like the same battle the next day, and that seems like amazing to me.
So yeah, I hope I'm not scaring anyone off if we have any warlocks in attendance, but yeah, we have gotten a couple people who didn't play or were thinking about getting back into a hunter, and they listen. Like we had the one question was like, should I get back into a hunter, or why should I? I feel like we get those every now and then, and people curious to get back into hunters, but I don't think we necessarily have any like rogues listening to us on a weekly basis. So that would be like us listening to a rogue podcast, which sounds awful. That sounds horrible. Like I can think of 100 things better to do with an hour in my life.
I did try a rogue once, and I hate the whole building up of stuff before you can actually get around to being powerful.
Yeah, I never liked the whole. At least early, I never really understood the whole combo point system, and
And then we all became Black Knights.
Yeah, I was about to say, like, at least it makes more sense than the Death Knight system, which I do understand, but that's its own thing. It took me a while to get used to it, and as soon as I did, I stopped playing my DK. So, because I think everyone has a DK that's at least like roaming around BC, like even if they dropped them at that point, because you can level
60.
Yeah, you can level the first 5 levels in a couple hours, and it's a fun starting zone too. So I think mine's at like 62 or something like that. But the priest was the only other one I got to end game, besides my hunter. So, all right.
Yeah, more or less down to hunters at this point for max level end game tunes.
Yeah, well, it was out of necessity. It was actually when I was going over to Frostheim server to do the which is now my server, but I was moving my hunter over there for a while, and we were going to work on some achievements and stuff, and like that's when I tanked Syndragosa back in Wrath and stuff, and I was leading 25s at the time, and I didn't have a tune to lead on anymore, and so I just like raced my priest. He was the closest. I raced him to endgame so that I could lead these 25s, and there wasn't really gear requirements at that point. I think you could just like wander in, and so I was leading a 25-man ICC in like heirlooms and blues. The first couple of weeks, it was pretty bad, but that was how I got him to endgame, and then I just kind of kept him there. So I didn't really. It wasn't like, oh, I want to play this, but oh, I need something else at endgame that isn't my hunter.
Right.
So. All right.
Well,
yeah,
I'm beyond my time here for today, but it was good. Next week should be fun. So, like I said, we got BRK coming, and that's always a good time. It'd be good to catch up and see what he's been up to and his thoughts on Hunters, this patch, and everything else.
He's always a blast. So I will be looking forward to that, and I think that's it. So, Ali, Dark, you guys have a good week, and thank you, chat room, and we'll see you next week.
Yep, we'll see you next week.
I can jump shot, BM, MM, and SV. I can rock out any tree. Never worried about my threat, 'cause I've got FD and misdirect. Catching loose mobs in my traps. I never miss, 'cause I am hit capped. 'Cause I'm the hunter, not the marked. I'm the fighter, not the spark. I'm the kiter, not the kite. I'll top meters every fight. Rating endgame, dealing death. Just me, my gun, and my trusty bed. Now let's begin with Illidan, Osirian, and Kil'jaeden, Magdamar, Asgalor, Gruul, Cthulhu, and Razorgore, Onyxia to Ragnaros, which